Welcome to a new executable items tutorial. In this case, I will explain you how to create a GTA 5 transition. To achieve this item, we will need storing information in variables, summoning armor stands individually per player so many players can run the GTA transition at the same time, and obviously armor stand manipulation. Before starting, this is not the only way to achieve this. This is the way I thought of. Examples are working with player instead of the armor stand, or working with display entities instead of the armor stand. Remember, this is my idea. You can achieve the same with other procedure. Just use your imagination. With that said, let's go to the item explanation. Okay, so first of all, the GTA transition is kinda a teleport from one place to another place. So this teleportation contains a smooth movement on y-axis because we move like to the top, then movement and down again to the block. And the third thing is that we are on a spectator mode to make the transition better visually. So let's understand this smooth teleportation. Starting from the beginning, we will need to understand the basic teleportation, where I am at certain position and I want to teleport to another position. The first thought would be teleporting to the exact coordinates, but we don't want that. We want the teleportation to be respect the player. So what are we going to do? We're going to set some values. Let's say I am at these coordinates and I want to be at these coordinates. We can do the math, and 150 less 100 is 50, but the idea is to make a formula that allow us to take that value. So that would be the position X, that means where I want to go, minus where I am, and that gives us the distance on X, and the same with the set value. Now, what is the thing? With this type of teleporting, we are teleporting from one place to another place abruptly, and we would like to make a smooth teleport. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a step teleportation. What does that mean? That means dividing the whole movement into steps. For example, let's create the step teleportation on 2 steps. That means teleporting myself to the half of the movement and then the other half. How can we know the movement on X and Z on each movement? Well, it's the same as before, but this time I have to divide for each step I want. That means in the first step I am teleporting 25 on X, and then on the second step 25 again, and the same on Z, -1 and then -10 and then -10 again. This is better than before, but not as smooth as we would like. To make it better, we need to create many steps. For example, 10 steps. Following what we said before, we can get the X value and the Z value needed on each movement, and we will make the teleportation smooth. So we have the first point ready. Now the movement on y-axis, it's the same we did before, but instead of teleporting into a specific block, we will need to select the ideal y we would want. In this case, I want the player to go above 50 blocks. So the first teleportation step on 10 steps is 5. With this, we are teleporting the player above. With what we learned before, we are teleporting the player to the position of the block selected, and then we are going to move down the player. Now, we are missing one thing. We want the player to be on a spectator mode. The first idea would be using the vanilla spectator, but that have some problems. For example, we have to make many teleports to avoid the movement of the camera manually by the player and the movement with WASD of the player position. So the best option is using the spectate command to make the player spectate an armor stand. In that way, the player can't move the camera and can't move the player. So now let's put everything we have said into an executable items. What we called position X and Z are called item variables. So let's create the variables needed for our item. We will need the variables end x, z, and y. Those variables represent where we want to arrive. That means the destination. Then we're going to create another variables to store the steps on axis x, y, and z. And finally, we will store the player pitch, so we can put the player on the same pitch he was before the animation. Now, as you saw in the video, with the right click, we select the destination block. So on the activator, right click, we're going to add as a command send message, and the block has set to certain coordinates. And the important part are the variable modifications. We will set each end axis to the block we have clicked. Oh, perfect, we have stored a block. Now let's do the teleportation part. Remember, we have NY, NZ, and NX. For the activator, right click, only block, and not sneaking. Now the way to activate the teleport is shifting and right clicking. That means an activator player right click with the condition of if sneaking. We are going to create 2 times the same activator. The first one to set the variables and the second one to run the animation. In the first activator, we are going to set the pitch of the player before the animation. So the variable pitch will be set to player pitch. Before calculating the steps, math reminder, well, you can see how mathematical signs affect parentheses. Why? Because on the variable modification, for example, the steps of the x-axis, it's final minus the position of the player because of the minus before the parentheses. And then we are dividing this into 10 steps. It's the same we learned before. Final minus start, dividing it into the steps you want. Now let's do the same with set, and now the y value, it's the same, but we are setting the beginning of the player to the player y plus 50 because that is the position where the player will be on the air, because the first y teleportation is 50 blocks above, and then the player position y plus 50 to the block selected. That means to the y of the block. Perfect. We have the variables selected. Perfect. We have the variables needed to make the animation. Reminder again, what variables do we have? We have the step for each axis. To make the teleportation, we will need to go to the second activator we created. Remember, the first one and the second one must be the same with the same condition. We will set the game mode of the player to spectator, and we will summon an armor stand, It's important to disable the gravity and to add a specific tag. The tag is needed so the armor stand is linked to the player. For example, in this case, the tag is the name of the player plus armor stand. And since the player name is unique on the server, it is impossible to have another armor stand of the same type. Now, the armor stand has summoned, but it must be on the same place as the player and looking at the same position. So we are going to teleport the armor stand to those coordinates. And after the armor stand has summoned, we're going to make the player to spectate that armor stand. The delay tick is needed because you have to wait until the armor stand actually exists. If you try to run the command spectate before the armor stand actually exists on the server, the spectate command will not run. And the limit 1 is important because even though there are no more armor stands with this tag, you cannot spectate more than one entity, so this part is needed. Now, the first part of the animation is making the player to look below. Let's do it. For this, we need to understand what is yaw and what is pitch. The yaw is the x-axis where you look left or right, and the pitch is if you look below or above. So in this case, we want to look below. That means pitch of a 9. So how are we going to animate the smooth transition between the player pitch and the pitch of 90? Well, it's the same we have done on the whole tutorial. It's a smooth transition with steps. So the final 90 minus the pitch of the player. It's divided by 20. That means the amount of steps there are, and you have to run this command 20 times because there are 20 steps. Now let's teleport the player above. It's the same. We are teleporting the armor stand 5 blocks above 10 times. That means 50 blocks. In this case, it's not needed to make the step and calculations because it will always be 50 blocks. In this part, you have to make the math of what degrees you need. So in 20 steps, the final pitch is 90. Well, with this command, we're now in the air. So let's create the movement on X and Z. To achieve this, it's very simple. It's the steps we have created on each coordinate. In this case, the steps of X go in the first place where the X coordinates are, and then the Z coordinates. Since on the variables we have set 10 steps, we are running this command 10 times. Now, after all these commands, the player has moved from the beginning on the air to the destination on the air. We have to put the player on the ground. So, we're going to teleport the player the same we did before, but with the variable of step on Y. And the way all these variables are calculated will have the sign of minus or plus automatically because of the math operation. And the same, it's 10 steps, so we run the command 10 times. Now we have to set the original pitch, so let's do that. It's the same we did before, but instead of going 90, we are reverting the process. And finally, we have to kill the player armor stand and set the original game mode of the player. In this case, I was testing in creative. And that's it. That's the end of the item. But warning, there are some problems of this item. Since I only created it for testing purposes, it doesn't save the player game mode. So if a player is testing in survival, for example, in my item, after the animation, it will set to creative. You can store the player game mode using another variable, and then after all the commands, set the player game mode to the game mode he was before. And also, if the player disconnects in the middle of the animation, it can mess up some things. The armor stand commands will keep running, so the problem is that the player will be on the air and he can die because of the fall. To avoid this, you can store the X, Y, and Z beginning values on a score variable, and using executable events detect if the player left the server in the middle of the animation, and if that's the case, when the player joins again, teleport the player to the beginning of the animation or to the end, however you want. I hope you understood everything. If you have any question, feel free to ask, and see you.